Picture this. It's 1492, and the massive landmass we now call the United States, well, it was completely unknown to the rest of the world. But fast forward to today, and we're looking at the ultimate global superpower. We're talking the biggest economy, the most formidable military, and the oldest continuous democracy on the planet. So you've got to wonder, how exactly does a totally unknown territory transform into the absolute epicenter of global dominance? Let's dive in.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking the unlikely superpower, a chronological history of America. Because, America's rise to the top, it absolutely wasn't a fluke. It was actually the result of centuries of highly calculated decisions, some seriously aggressive expansions, and a few truly world-changing conflicts. So here is our chronological roadmap for today. We'll start with the discovery of the New World, move on to its capture by European countries, the American Revolution, expansion and the Civil War, and finally, wrap up with the rise to a modern superpower. Let's get right to it.
Starting with Section 1, Discovery of the New World, which was really just an accidental finding. And honestly, it all kicks off with an incredibly ambitious quest for navigation.
Back in the 1400s, Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator set the stage by establishing this legendary school of navigation to basically map the known world. Now, decades after Henry's death, an ambitious sailor named Christopher Columbus took up the baton. He was dead set on finding a western sea route to India. So, backed by the Spanish crown, Columbus set sail in 1492. But, as we know, instead of hitting India, he stumbles right into the Americas.
And this right here led to one of history's absolute biggest geographic blunders. Columbus was so convinced he'd actually reached India that when he encountered the native inhabitants, he labeled them Red Indians. It's kind of crazy, right? A massive mix-up that coined a term that just stuck for centuries, though those native populations were later properly referred to as Amerindians.
Moving on to Section 2, Capture by European countries, and the Great Race for Land. Because once word got out about this vast, resource-rich new territory, it triggered an absolute frenzy. By the 1700s, it was basically a giant land grab. European powers were eagerly carving up the continent. Spain jumped in early with major land claims. France scooped up massive swaths of territory, including what's now Canada, and Britain. They established these huge, sprawling colonies right along the eastern coast. Now, while this tragically displaced the Native American populations who already lived there, the colonies simultaneously became a haven for persecuted Europeans who were desperately seeking equality and a fresh start.
All right, on to Section 3, American Revolution and Independence. This is where the colonies finally push back, because eventually the people living under British rule hit a massive boiling point. See, Britain was slapping incredibly strict, oppressive laws onto its American colonies. They enforced these harsh trade monopolies, literally dictating that all colonial trade had to pass exclusively through Britain, no exceptions. The real breaking point, though, came after the 7 Years' War. Britain won, which wiped out the French presence, but it left the British government buried in debt. Their solution? Slap crushing taxes on the American colonies. This whole taxation without representation dynamic sparked widespread outrage, which ultimately ignited the revolution in 1765. From there, the escalation was incredibly rapid. By 1775, the colonies officially said enough is enough and demanded total independence. And crucially, France stepped in to back the Americans, mostly to stick it to their mutual rival, Britain. That alliance, it proved totally fatal to British control. The decisive moment hit in 1781, when British General Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington's forces at Yorktown. Finally, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris made the end of the war official. But the real culmination of this era happened in 1776. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was officially adopted. Interestingly, it was Thomas Paine who suggested the now iconic name, the United States of America. This paved the way for the world's very first written constitution to be put in place by 1788, with George Washington stepping up as the very first president. Let's look at Section 4, Expansion, Slavery, and Civil War. Because as you can imagine, building a superpower almost never happens without some serious growing pains. The newly formed U.S. quickly adopted a super aggressive expansionist policy to stretch its borders westward. In 1803, they pulled off what has to be one of the greatest real estate deals in human history, the Louisiana Purchase. For just $15 million, which is wild to think about today, they bought a massive chunk of territory from France, instantly tripling the country's size.
And they didn't stop there. They acquired even more vast lands after defeating Mexico in 1845.
But internally, there was a stark economic and moral divide that literally threatened to tear the brand new nation apart. On one side, you had the northern states, which were largely industrial and opposed to slavery. On the other side, the southern states heavily relied on the labor of enslaved Africans to power their highly profitable cotton farming. This incredibly deep, fundamental divide over the institution of slavery ultimately culminated in the devastating American Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865.
Ultimately, under the leadership of President Abraham Lincoln, who was tragically assassinated for his efforts, slavery was abolished. However, it's important to note that the historical legacy of racial tension obviously didn't just disappear overnight. In fact, it continues to manifest today in ongoing social struggles and modern movements like Black Lives Matter.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 5, How America Became a Superpower. So, how exactly did this recently unified, expanded nation step up to achieve global dominance?
Well, first off, you have to look at geography. Protected by two vast oceans and bordered by relatively weaker neighbors, America was incredibly difficult to invade. It was basically a giant natural fortress. This isolation allowed for immense internal economic growth. Then, when Europe was completely devastated by World War I, America was able to decisively intervene. Later, following the shocking attack on Pearl Harbor in World War II, the U.S. projected absolutely unmatched military power, particularly against Japan, firmly proving itself as a formidable global force.
Post-World War II, America strategically built a new global system. To counter the Soviet Union, they established powerful military alliances, most notably NATO. And to lock in their economic dominance, they created huge financial anchors like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. This basically ensured that global trade became permanently tied to the US dollar, all backed by a military presence spanning dozens of countries.
And this essentially became the modern American playbook, the strategy of indirect global influence. Instead of continuing to expand its physical borders, the U.S. started intervening in the internal affairs of other nations. They stepped into the role of a global peacekeeper, which allowed them to maintain immense control and secure their own strategic interests worldwide.
Which brings us right to today. After centuries of calculated expansion and strategic moves, the U.S. sits firmly at the top. But, as we all know, the geopolitical landscape is always shifting. Today, China has emerged as a direct, powerful challenger, especially visible in recent fierce trade wars. So, I want to leave you with this thought. Is America's centuries-long reign as the undisputed global superpower a permanent reality? Or are we currently watching the crown begin to slip?